How's everyone doing tonight? Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. For those of you that don't know, my name is Johnathan Plaza. I'm based in Miami, right? I was here last year with House of Worship family. Also conducting a training on behavior analysis. And last year, this came about very unplanned. It was very last minute, right? But it was a huge blessing for not only us, but for so many families. So I wanted to take the opportunity to do it again and almost make this almost like a yearly thing, right? Where we can get together, right, and provide obviously a resource for many families and be a blessing to others, right? So today I wanted to cover almost like part two of last year's training, and I wanted to get a little bit more specific when it comes to child therapy and some of the concepts that we covered last year, but perhaps not get too technical with it, get more, say, more relatable, right, with some of these terms and some of these strategies that can help. So one of the biggest motivators for me to do this training and title it A Compassionate Approach is because sometimes there is a not so favorable narrative surrounding ABA and the application of ABA in children with special needs, right? A lot of that has to do with lack of training, has to do with outdated approaches that no longer should be applied, right, in children that have special needs. So today, what I wanted to do is kind of tackle those a little bit, unpack some of those, and provide some strategies and some basically just some insights on what can be effective and effective therapy and what effective therapy can look like for children on the spectrum. So again, very quickly, what is applied behavior analysis? Ultimately, it's a systematic method to analyzing behavior, why behavior occurs, and how it occurs, right? So that is a very straightforward, relatable definition. Didn't want to get too technical, right? But some of the key principles are environmental factors, right? A lot of our job as a behavior analyst is to identify how does the environment affect behavior. In some cases, it occasions behavior, right? So being able to understand that relationship and analyze those factors is part of what we do as ABA therapists. Behavior, one of the key principles of behavior analysis is also reinforcement. Behavior tends to flow where reinforcement is, right? We do something that is reinforcing to us, and we are likely to do it again, right? So you should be familiar with positive reinforcement, things of those nature, right? So behavior that is not reinforced tends to decrease over time. You start to do something and you don't see a positive reward from it, right? You tend to not engage in that behavior anymore over time. So a lot of what behavior analysis is founded on learning theory and how individuals learn, right? And a lot of learning has to do with conditioning. If something is rewarding, you do it again. If something is punishing, you're least likely to do it, right? And we learn that early on. We touch a stove and it's hot. We don't touch it again because it was punishing. It wasn't reinforcing. It wasn't rewarding. So that's basically the learning theory behind behavior analysis. Some of the core principles, the antecedents, things that happen before the behavior, right? We have behavior that we are looking to modify. It's important for us to identify the things that happen prior to the behavior to see what are triggering some of these behaviors in order for us to be able to manipulate those things and create treatment that is lasting and that's effective, right? So we have the behavior, the action in itself, with the behavior of interest, and consequences is what happens immediately after that behavior, right? So just to give a hypothetical example, we have a child that begins to engage in self-injury behavior every time he sees therapists walk in, right? So the antecedents would be the child sees the presence of the therapist. It occasions the behavior of self-injury. The consequence is usually either, in some cases, the therapy doesn't take place, or in some cases, therapy goes through, right? And that behavior is punished, right? For the child's engaging in SIV, regardless of therapy takes place, and then ultimately there's a bad learning history that takes place between therapy and the behaviors, right? So ABA relies heavily on data collection to guide interventions and decisions and overall progress. We hang our heads on being evidence-based, an evidence-based practice, right? So it has to be it has to be resulting in change, right, in order for it to be considered effective, right? So we really focus a lot on data collection. We measure, right? And this is a big part of what we do as behavior analysts. But today, the focus for me was basically trying to tackle some of these outdated methodologies in ABA and highlight why, in some cases, ABA isn't effective with children on the spectrum, right? Right, so we have the 4 functions of behavior, right? This is all typical ABA stuff, right? Attention, escape, access, and sensory. And actually, we talked about this last year, right? When we talked about these things, and 4 reasons why behavior occurs. We want access to attention, right? We want access, or we're trying to escape or avoid a situation. These are all 4 motivating factors for behavior and why they occur, right? Access to tangibles, we want to physically access something that we want, or sensory stimulation, something that is just internally rewarding to us, right? So to give some examples, an attention-maintained behavior, right? A child that has limited expressive language and communication may engage in, let's say, loud vocalizations or screaming, right? In order to get their mother's attention, right? That may be one maintaining variable or one motivating factor for the child to engage in that behavior. To escape, maybe that same individual is placed with a task that he or she may not find to be rewarding. They engage in that same screaming. At that point in time, the screaming is occurring because they're looking to escape that demand, right? Access to tangibles, with that same example, would be the child screaming because he wants to request a certain toy, an iPad, a tablet, whatever it may be, access to something that is tangible that they enjoy. And they use that behavior to communicate that, right? And the sensory stimulation in children with autism, we see a lot of self-stimulatory behavior, right? Where it's a lot of self-soothing, a lot of behaviors that occur without it having to be mediated by anyone, right? The child could be left alone in a room, and without the presence of anyone there, the child may be engaging in hand flapping and rocking, visual stereotypy, right? Motor stereotypy, which is like almost like ritualistic movements, right? Or sometimes ritualistic vocalizations. And these are not mediated by anyone, so it's just something that feels good, right? For someone who is not on the spectrum, self-stimulatory behavior or sensory stimulation, for me, for example, I'll give you myself, for example, I had this thing, I bite my lip. I don't know why. It's like a nervous thing, but it's self-soothing, right? When I was younger, I used to move my leg all the time, right? Yeah, and it's you know, it's self-soothing. It's self-soothing. I don't look to gain attention from it. I don't look to escape anything, right? I don't need access to something in particular. It just feels good to me, right? Right? It's self-soothing. I move my leg a lot. Sometimes I bite my lip. And there's that sensory component to it, right? So where are the limitations with this type of methodology, right? When we go into ABA therapy, and we have therapists that work with children on the spectrum, we analyze each behavior under these 4 main factors or main variables, right? And that in itself is a very limiting approach when you are considering human behavior. Because human behavior, there's so many moving parts to it. There's so many factors that influence human behavior, and it's very difficult to really say that just 4 factors can influence behavior, right? There's so many other factors that we don't account for in ABA yet. We go in and we work with these children that have special needs, and it's almost like we have very rigid methodologies, right? And it's like, no, this is how we have to target this behavior because my science says it has to be one of these 4, right? And then when you work with children long enough, you learn that it isn't that easy. And that same behavior that occurs today for attention can occur tomorrow for escape or for access to tangibles, right? Or it could be, so it's not as what you just said, a cookie cutter approach, right? So, and unfortunately, we don't have enough training in ABA to really unpack, human behavior, right? We're provided with this information, and we are expected to apply it and generalize it to children who have all types of behaviors, right? So the focus for me after being able to work with children for over 15 years has been I've learned, okay, ABA is very effective in many ways, right? Especially with individuals outside of the spectrum, I would say, right? I would say. Um, but when it comes to working with children on the spectrum, right, there's always been for me like a missing component. And then last year, actually no, it wasn't last year, this year, I was able to attend a workshop, a seminar, Dr. Hanley, Dr. Hanley. He has a very unique approach, and it's basically built on building rapport and compassion, right, and meeting the child where they're at. And I feel like that training finished, it didn't finish shaping my approach because I'm always learning and I'm always shaping my approach, but it really made everything come together, right? Because everything that I was practicing within my therapies, he was discussing it in a way that was very written down as a protocol, very something that could be replicated, right? And the whole time I was practicing that without knowing it. So going to that training for me was really an eye-opener. It really prompted me to want to switch my training and the trainings and the information that I share with families, with therapists, to really bring attention to what compassionate approach should look like, right? And how that results in lasting change over time for children on the spectrum, right? So recognizing the complexities of human behavior and the individual behind the behavior, right? That's one of the biggest ingredients when it comes to compassion in ABA. And being able to balance how rigid you could be sometimes as a behavior therapist and being able to provide empathy, right, during therapy. That has a lot to do with understanding and respecting boundaries and being able to give the child a voice, or the individual that you're working with a voice, right? A lot of times this comes with experience and practice and trial and error, but my goal through these trainings for individuals like yourself who are just starting now in the field is to be able to almost cut your path in half, right? Where you don't have to learn through trial and error, but instead will provide you with something that can be replicated, right? And then not only can be of service to you, but it can provide a positive experience and a learning experience for the child that you're working with, right? So ultimately, a compassionate approach, it will set the table for integrative care, which I'm going to look into a little further. We're going to talk about it a little further. We're going to unpack it, what integrative care looks like when we're talking about children on the autism spectrum, right? So I'm huge on holistic approaches, integrative care, and this past year I've had the opportunity to work with many different professionals that work with children on the autism spectrum, in particularly neurology. And for this past year, I've been able to do some collaborative work with neurologists, and there's been several therapeutic interventions and methodologies that they practice that have really caught my attention, and through being able to practice it, I've seen how effective it could be, right? And it just has even further shaped my approach when it comes to therapy with children on the spectrum. Instructional control. In ABA therapy, as therapists, we're told when we come in, working with a child on the spectrum, we have to establish ourselves, right? So how do we do that? We pair, right? You're familiar with pairing, right? Pairing is be fun, right? Be fun for the child, associate yourself with fun, right? So that all of it, right? Right. So yeah, so initially, that initial interaction and that relationship has to be built through fun, right? So we identify what is most rewarding to the child or the individual, right? And we associate ourselves with that in order to create almost like a positive dynamic or narrative surrounding us, right? So that our presence signals fun, ultimately, right? So where are the limitations in that approach? Actually, we'll get to that in a second. That's on the next slide. But really quickly to define instructional control, for those that are not in the ABA field per se and then want to know a little bit about instructional control, is the ability to guide and direct learning, right? As a person in a position to teach and learn, your instructional control is your ability to guide that individual, that learner, through the lesson, right? And do it in a way where the individual is receptive to your teachings, right? What it isn't is absolute obedience and compliance, right? And this is where it gets a little messy sometimes in ABA, where our approach sometimes could be a little too focused on compliance, right? And a lot of that has to do with data collection and wanting to have therapy that looks good on paper. Oh, the child did this amount of correct responses. And if I don't get this amount of correct responses, then something's wrong with my instructional control, right? I don't have control of the situation, or he's not being receptive to what I'm doing, right? So along with that comes a lot of practices and methodologies of, hey, you have to follow through, right? Following through, right? And this is something that we'll unpack a little bit further now in a couple slides, but it's the instructional control plays a huge role in the success of your therapy in the long term, right? And it's shaped early on, right? So I'll talk a little bit about how we shape good instructional control, or more than instructional control, it's a focus on rapport, right? It's a focus on rapport and a child-led experience, and I think that's what really takes us to the next level. Using preference assessments, right? This is one thing that you may not have the opportunity to do that yet, but you will, right? And it's just allowing the child to have the opportunity to identify the things that are rewarding to them, and then use them, right? Okay, beautiful, right? So using those to motivate the child into your lessons your lessons will likely be challenging, right? And there will be something that pushes the child outside of their comfort zone, so there has to be motivation there. But the preference assessments allow us as therapists to observe where the child is naturally gravitating to, so that we can use these things for motivation, right? To increase motivation, right? So right now, so far, things that you're familiar with already, right? So let's talk about the bad around instructional control, right? Generalizing reinforcers. It's a big common mistake that I see in therapists and just in the science in general. Since reinforcement is such a big part of what we do, we think that certain reinforcers are reinforcing to everyone, right? Something as simple as a child does something great and we say, good job. And we assume that because we said good job and we said high five, right, or we clapped, oh, great work, that child is receiving praise or reinforcement, right? And in fact, for some children, that could be overstimulating, right? A loud clap could be aversive, right? Sometimes saying too much during therapy is just already, a bad start, right? So sometimes less is more in a lot of cases, right? But so we see that a lot, right? Token boards, token systems, right? If you're familiar with token systems, giving a child a bunch of stars and happy faces, and we assume that a star or a happy face has a meaning to the child, and we're like, hey, you got a happy face, great job, and the kid's looking at you like, what is that? Right? So, right. So that's one of the biggest, I would say one of the biggest factors that doesn't allow you to establish good instructional control. You think you're doing all of it, and you're really not doing much, right? We talked about being too rigid with your protocols, not having flexibility, right? And I think that goes a long way in being able to provide a child-led experience, right? If you're too rigid with having to meet certain criteria and certain timers, and we have to work for the next 10 minutes before we get a break, right? So if we do that and we don't have flexibility in that regard, then we start to lose the child, we start to lose rapport, right? The ugly. We talked about the power dynamics in therapy relationships. That's one of them, right? It's almost like a power struggle. Like, no, everything's going to be under my control. And we're taught, hey, follow through. We place one demand. If you don't start following through, we start physically prompting. Hey, go pick up, your pencil. We don't see action. We start prompting physically, right? So that could be, right, one way that you start to lose trust in the individual and the child, right? Instead, if the child is throwing the pencil, we have to identify why that's happening, and how can we motivate that child to be more willing to collaborate with us rather than to engage in behavior that's looking to escape demands, right? And respecting personal boundaries, we talked about that. So being able to not only provide a child-led experience, but understanding that children on the autism spectrum are also experiencing a wide range of emotions, right? And just because they can't communicate it sometimes through expressive language doesn't mean they're not feeling scared, anxious, worried, tired, right? So being able to be aware of these things, plays a big role in building rapport. How exactly do we practice compassion? An individualized approach, right? So being able to understand the person behind the behavior and tailor your teachings in a way that it fits the needs of that child, right? And sometimes as ABA therapists, like I mentioned, we have a very overgeneralized approach, and having that personalized approach is really allows you to create targets that are going to be meaningful for that particular person, right? So considering the whole person is very much aligned with a holistic approach, right? And the holistic approach, we take all things into account. Anything that could be influencing behavior, right? And this in ABA is something that is not common because we don't have enough training on many other different areas that affect behavior, both from an emotional standpoint, but also from a physical standpoint. And we'll cover some of those now. But another way that we can promote compassion is by involving caregivers in training, right? During therapies, involving them during therapies, respecting choices, allowing children to have choices during therapy, using least restrictive interventions, making sure that we're only physically prompting if we need to during tasks that require physical guidance, but allowing the child to lead in many ways. And then when there's times that things need to be done, because in therapy things need to be done, if we've built enough rapport, then the child will be likely to be more receptive to times where we won't be able to take a break. We won't be able to take a step back. But we've already established enough trust that the child is willing to work through that moment, and then obviously good outcomes come from that. So gradually increasing intensity, and only increasing it if necessary, right? That goes a long way. And celebrating small wins for me is a big deal. So something that goes a long way with compassion, and I'll tell you this directly since you're working with children, is, if you early on, if you're noticing resistance from a child on the autism spectrum, you're trying to get a lesson across, and you're working on pairing, if you notice compliance or if you notice willingness to participate, whether it's transitioning, like, hey, John, walk with me, and you see John walking in that transition, walking with you, rather than waiting until you guys get to the table and complete the entire task, move on to the outside area and complete the criteria you've set for him, reward that willingness to walk with you, right? So So that is something that you would identify in your preference assessment, right, early on, right, where you would just allow the child free access to everything that is most rewarding to the child, right? And the way you obtain that information is through the parents. The parents are the experts. Parents are the experts on all things that child, right? So one way that you can obtain all the information that you need is to, you're getting the mic? It's all good. So one way that you can obtain that information on what's reinforcing to the child, we ask the parents, involve the parents. Something as simple, I'll give you an example. If you want to find out what's motivating for the child, what's reinforcing to the child, ask the parents, how can they turn off the behavior, right? So if we have a child that engages in screaming or self-injury behavior or property destruction, and we ask mom, if I give you $1 million, how would you stop this? Hypotheticals, that's what I call them, like motivated hypotheticals. I give you $10 million right now. How do you stop your kids crying? They'll say, give them a tablet. Okay, that's my reinforcer. I need to use that during my therapies. Oh, I don't know, I give him his favorite toy because he doesn't stop playing with that toy and he won't stop screaming unless I give him, okay, I need to use that toy, right? I need to have it on my side so that I could be motivating and the whole lesson could be motivating. It's just, I don't want to reinforce it when she bites, right? But I want to use it in a way that is an active part of our therapy, right? Because that way I have the child's attention, right? So that's one way to really identify what is the reinforcer that we're going to be using, right? So when I'm transitioning and I'm giving that, I'm providing those small wins, I'm celebrating those small wins, I'm reinforcing with the known reinforcer that I've already identified, right? So you're walking with me. If it's cookie, I may have one cookie cut into 10 pieces, right? And I'm like, hey, you know what? I love how you're walking with me. You want a piece of cookie? Oh, perfect opportunity to teach, to work on requesting, right? I want cookie. Great job asking. Cookie, walk with me, right? Child is motivated to continue doing work with me because I'm the cookie man. I got the cookies, right? And I'm using it as an opportunity to promote language, right? To promote language. And in the process, our rapport is strong, right? Our rapport is strong. Motivation is up. So going back to holistic approaches, right? It's important to prioritize quality of life, right? So a lot of times when we're working with children, we're working on academic material. We're doing a lot of tabletop activities, right? And a lot of times these type of activities don't translate to real life scenarios, right? So it's important to create lessons that occur outside of the table, right? So because the children are not going to live in those controlled environments all the time, so we have to prepare them for it, right? So a lot of our therapy should take place in the natural environment. And a holistic approach, when we're taking a whole person into account, we're accounting for emotions, physical aspects, and we'll talk about kind of medical factors that could influence behavior in a few. But another thing that could influence behaviors could be physical health and nutrition, right? So these are big components that manifest themselves in behavior, not only in children on the autism spectrum. So I was just having a conversation with Alex about this, right? The physical factors that can influence behavior, right? So just to give you an example, if we have a mineral imbalance, can result in anxiety, right? So you can have someone who is experiencing anxiety-like behavior, right? Avoidance, which is also closely associated with anxiety. And if they go do a comprehensive exam, you might find a mineral imbalance, an imbalance in magnesium, for example, right? I'm sorry? There's a deficiency somewhere, right? So that's just one example, right? We talked about, in the conversation that I had with Alex, we talked about testosterone for older kiddos, right? So we have children that we work with that are on, teenage years, right? We have also individuals on the spectrum that we work with that are early adulthood, right? And testosterone levels, right? We may have a child that is overly aggressive, impulsive, just inability to regulate in many situations emotionally, and that's all aligned with having your testosterone through the roof, for example, right? So if you have testosterone through the roof, and you're trying, as an ABA therapist, you're trying to provide strategies on how to regulate yourself, on how not to be so impulsive, it's almost like we're patching a symptom, right, of an underlying condition, right? So we're swimming against the current, right? Because no matter how much we do the proactive strategies and the deep breathing and for regulation, when you leave, the testosterone levels on that individual are still the same, right? So the impulsivity is going to be there. The aggression may be there, right? The short leash on things may still be there. So we have to take those things into account when it comes to behavior. That's one other factor that affects behavior. Sleep. I have mentioned here sleep. Many of my children that I've worked with have irregular sleep patterns, right? And obviously that affects behavior. You have a long night, the next day you got to go to work, irritable. You may be irritable, right? You may not have the same motivation. You may not get through your workout if you're going to do a workout, right? Your work day may not be as effective or efficient, right? And when we transfer this or we apply this to a child on the spectrum who has to sit now through 3 different therapies on that day, there may be a lot of avoidance behavior, aggression, self-injury, right? There may be a lot of those behaviors because of the irregular sleep patterns, right? Also, the irregular sleep patterns would be the antecedent, what happens before the behavior, right? But also that irregular sleep pattern could be an unbalance, right? An imbalance, a mineral imbalance. Magnesium can also result in lack of sleep, right? Back to the hormones, same, elevated estrogen, lack of sleep, right? These are all things that manifest as behaviors, and we have to look into these things before we can really select an appropriate treatment plan for that. Otherwise, we're just patching symptoms, and we're not really looking at the underlying causes.
Okay, so she's a very poor eater. She's never eaten a meal. She'll be 7 now in November. So I have to pick my battles. So
Okay.
we only eat snacks all day, and they're all horrible food coloring. So what do you do in that situation? Because if I don't give her those snacks, then we're not eating anything throughout the day.
That's a good question. I think those snacks would qualify as her reinforcement.
Yeah.
Right? So we have to use that to present our exposure to different foods, right? So access to her preferred foods, which she normally has free access to all the time, now has to be made contingent upon her participation with being exposed to different foods, right?
Okay.
right? So let's say she has the favorite gummy that she always
Yeah.
eats, or the favorite chips that she always. But if she has open access to them at all times, then she's not going to be as motivated to try the piece of chicken you present, because she knows if she holds off on that,
She'll
she's
get
going to
her
get the
snack.
chips later.
And she
right?
knows that.
She knows that, right? So, but knowing what the preferred foods are is crucial, because now, same way with the same example of the reinforcement, we use that now in our favor to create motivation for exposure of, to other things, other foods, right?
Okay.
So, a hypothetical example for food therapy, right? Preferred foods, let's say, is the gummy, like we mentioned. Now, access to gummies may be available if the child, let's say, touches the chicken. In a situation where the child is too aversive against chicken, right?
Yeah, because like texture bothers
Because
her
of
a lot.
texture and things like that, so just touching it. Then one touch, gummy. One touch, cookie, whatever it may be. And then
Okay.
we shape that, right? Oh, now touching it is not sufficient to receive your preferred food. Now you have to touch it with your lips, touch it with your tongue, hold it in your mouth. You don't have to eat it or swallow it, right? You start changing criteria to the point where it's like, okay, now you're gonna chew a piece of chicken, swallow that little piece of chicken, you get 3 chips, 4 chips, whatever it may be. But providing that exposure
Yeah.
allows the child to see, you know what, this chicken is not that bad. Like, I'm gonna try another one on my own, right?
Yeah.
So it's not, a lot of times with the children on autism spectrum, it's not so much that they don't want to eat the food, it just doesn't look appetizing to them in
Yeah.
some cases, right? And there's just that avoidance early on without even them being exposed to it or knowing what it even tastes like. So we need to create conditions where we expose them to it, so that
And
they
she like
can,
has like no desire to eat. Like I think even she just like doesn't even think it's like a priority for her.
right.
to eat.
So sometimes, and I've had that with some families, right, where it's like my son won't eat, and if I don't provide him with the snacks,
Yeah.
then he won't eat all day, right? So, but sometimes what we do as parents, because I'm a parent, I have 3 boys, right? And I have one, my smallest, who doesn't eat well, right? And because I don't want him to starve, I give him whatever he
Yeah.
wants, right?
Exactly.
But as a parent, I know that I have to now start withholding some of that, right? Because when he's very hungry, this is happening right now that we're out traveling here in New York. He's outside of his comfort zone. In Miami, he gets all his snacks at home. He opens the pantry, he knows where all the
Yeah,
snacks
that's
are. and he
exactly
eats.
the same thing.
Here we're in the middle of Manhattan, right? And we have just shops around the hotel. So now it's a little trickier. Guess what? He's starving. He doesn't have his favorite snacks, and I'm eating a wrap, and he's starving, and he's taking bites out of my wrap, right? So I have to replicate that at home, near the
Yeah.
pantry, right? So it doesn't
Or
mean
maybe even take it out of like their reach or where they can see it.
for sure that's a proactive strategy, right? But definitely using the known reinforcers or the known snacks to create motivations for the non-preferred ones, right? And then progressing, gradually.
I moved everything down thinking I was like making it better for her. I'm like, look, you're independent, grab everything.
No, so definitely using the ones that are known, and then making them available upon their participation with other foods and exposure to other foods, for sure. Go ahead.
When introducing, so I'm a classroom para for 15 years.
Okay.
I've worked with gen ed and special ed students, and in some cases you get students who they don't even know they're on the spectrum yet with families, right? So at this point they're just, no quiere comer. Like
Yeah.
they're not thinking that it's sensory or anything like that. I did have a student last year who didn't eat, and they wanted me to try to feed him all day long.
Okay.
And how do you, I kind of was like, I see it working, but I was more like, can we just introduce the food during lunch maybe only? So when giving her that advice, do you introduce the chicken every day for a week, for 1 hour a day, or would it be something that you do for 24 hours, like all day long? Yeah, like how, or do you go based on the behavior, or if the child is?
I think all of the situations they vary, right?
Right.
So we may have a child that is extreme with their resistance against food, right? To the point where they hold off
Yeah.
completely, right? So for that individual, if we wait off 1 hour, right? If we only presented, let's say, for example, during lunchtime, that individual is likely to just hold off for an hour, because they know that, right? Hold off for an hour because when I get home after school, mom's gonna give me all the snacks, especially if the feedback from the teacher is, she didn't eat anything today. Mom's in a rush home to get the cookies, right? So those, in that situation, the child is very aware. All of our children are very aware, right? So they know I could just hold off. Same thing happens with potty training. Early on, in certain cases, right? They don't have a diaper on. They just hold until the diaper comes back on when mom picks them up at school. So same thing happens here with food, right? So in my experience, what I've done sometimes, I've presented food all the time, at all times. So one of the biggest things, and I wanted to talk about that, was food exposure, right? So during therapy, or even outside of therapy, if you're, as a parent, have the non-preferred food available, but with no demands to eat it. Just have it available, right? Because sometimes they just have a bad history between the child and the food. So in some cases, it's because we as parents or as therapists have tried to force the child that you got to eat your chicken or you got to eat your rice because you're not eating protein and you're only eating snacks and you can't just eat snacks. And if it's if it's food therapy, and if it's not through a child-led approach or a compassionate approach, then some kids could be being force-fed, right, which creates trauma in a child who has autism, right? So a lot of times what you want to do is just give the child exposure to the chicken. I'm going to keep using chicken because I love chicken. So I'm going to just, right, so you just give exposure to it because the child now starts to associate the chicken with no pressure. Like it's just there, right? No one's telling me, no one's prompting me to do it, right? It could be intimidating when you have an adult, like, hey, eat the chicken. Hey, eat the chicken. Right, even, right? So then the child starts to associate chicken, physical restraint, right? Right, physical restraint, and that's coming from you as a parent. So imagine if it's a therapist, right? Right, that's even, could be more traumatic, right? It could create even worse of a problem. Right, so sometimes a proactive strategy would be to just have it ready there and available, right? Have the non-preferred food available with no demands to eat it, just so that you can create a different learning history there, or a different narrative around that food. Hey, every time this chicken comes out, someone prompts me to eat it. Someone physically restrains me. Someone, guides me through it. Instead, what we want to do now is bring the chicken out. The child's looking for the person who's going to prompt them. No one's there. Next day, same thing happens. Next week, chicken's still there. There's no one here force feeding me. There's no one here, pushing, this chicken down my throat. Let's see what's up with this chicken, right? What's the big deal with this chicken? Let me touch it. Let me try it. So now there's a more willingness to even be open to it, right? And now when there's that willingness, and you've already built or established rapport, right? And your approach is compassionate, child-led. The child is now willing to use that chicken and try it or do whatever lesson that you have, for food therapy, right? So it's I think exposure and having that constant exposure, it goes a long way when it comes to sensitivity to food and food therapy in general. But the idea here was that food plays a big role in behavior as well, right? A child that doesn't have the right nutrients not only has mineral imbalances and things like that, but they also don't have the energy to go through therapy in many cases, and they can manifest as behaviors for sure.
There are many outdated practices that affect the quality of therapy. Probably an unpopular opinion, but the notion that all human behavior can be tied to just 4 underlying reasons can be somewhat limiting when you consider how complex human behavior is. Too many factors influence what we do on a day-to-day, especially in children on the autism spectrum with communication difficulties. Poor training and outdated practices result in therapists ignoring behavior that shouldn't be ignored and forcing compliance for behaviors that are not attempts at escaping demands. Not all therapy is quality therapy. Part of my purpose on here is to show that there's therapy where children are willing learners, progress is ongoing, and change is sustainable. And then there's therapy that just looks good on paper. In 15 years of therapy, you learn what works and what doesn't, but one thing remains constant. Building and maintaining rapport determines success of treatment over time. And this is true for any type of therapy. Stay tuned for part 2, where I'll dive into how building rapport can prevent severe behavior, empower children, and set the table for lasting change.
So this was just an introduction to basically what our training is about today: compassion, rapport, building trust, and using that to create conditions where children are receptive to the learning and the lessons that you want to provide them. So with part 2, let me see if I can find the part 2. Where are we? This is the part 2, and this is
All right, let's get right
a little
to
bit
it.
more in
Here,
depth.
we're looking to establish rapport. No unnecessary dialogue or unnecessary physical interaction taking place. Only goal here is to foster a fun environment while waiting for a social cue from the learner, indicating that he is ready for engagement. Once I'm fully incorporated into his play, I attempt to transition into the skill-based part of his session. The initial attempt to transition is met with resistance. I step back, recognizing that resistance as a sign that I may be doing too much too soon. I don't assume he is attempting to escape demands. Assuming that may have resulted in increased self-injury, possibly aggression. On the second attempt, he willingly moves to the table. Instead of starting work right away, I reinforce that willingness by allowing him more play.
Those were the small wins. We
Next,
talked about
I
rewarding the
attempt to
small wins.
transition. This time, placing the instruction while sitting at the table without physically assisting him. Again, I reward his willingness before starting to work.
I love how you're listening.
On the final
you get more access to
transition,
play.
I invite him over. He joins and he starts work willingly, without resistance, trusting that his needs will be respected if at any point he were to feel overwhelmed. Resistance isn't always about escaping demands. Sometimes it's a sign that something is off in the environment or in the conditions that you have created as a therapist.
So after enough small wins, enough trust is built as to where now the child understands, or the individual understands, you know what, this person acknowledges me as a person, respects my boundaries, my emotions, and what I could be feeling. And now they're willing to sit. That child in that video, after that, we sat for 45 minutes without taking any breaks. So that willingness and that compliance provided an opportunity for him to learn now, because that trust allows him now to sit and be engaged. And that's what we need in order for him to really be receptive to the lesson, right? If we're managing behavior the entire time during the session, our session is not effective and we don't provide any learning opportunities. This is sensory
In some
integration.
cases, individuals with autism spectrum disorder experience challenges with sensory integration. Understanding sensory input in relation to your child's specific needs can be the difference between setting a learner up for skill-based treatment or dysregulation that results in hyperactivity, inattention, or problem behavior. Once rapport has been established, we begin preparing him to transition by allowing a preferred activity that also promotes coordination, awareness, and ultimately increases the likelihood of him performing well during the skill-based parts of our treatment. Some individuals are over-responsive, some are under-responsive, while others are sensory seekers, always on the move, looking for a sensory experience. In traditional ABA, behaviors that appear to be sensory-driven are categorized as automatic reinforcement, which can be a limited and incomplete analysis of behavior. Interventions may include providing sensory alternatives while teaching new ways to seek or request input. But how can we do that effectively without a basic understanding of sensory integration? It's not a question of scope of practice, it's best practice. Understanding how environmental, social, emotional, and physiological factors shape behavior allows you to create more supportive environments that are conducive to behavior reduction and skill acquisition.
Where's your nose? No. So there was two videos, last two videos I want to share are on sensitivity, has a lot to do with sensory processing, and it's a common issue in many cases with children on the spectrum, and it's the barbershop situation, right? Which could be a little bit overwhelming sensory-wise, right? So I want to share this one just because I know this may be relatable to Mason in particular. So this is early on, before I even show the video, Before I even show the video, I want to share that the child, typically for a haircut, is restrained, right? And they try to wait as long as possible between haircuts because it's such an aversive situation. Driving into the driveway or into the parking lot, the shopping center, is already enough of a aversive situation for the child where he already recognizes the shopping center, starts to engage in self-injury, aggression, or maladaptive behavior, right? So we identified this as a problem, right? And we want to avoid the child experiencing that aversiveness all the time and creating trauma ultimately, right? So we wanted to start working with that progressively, using trust, compassion, and building rapport, right? To create a situation where the child is willing to participate on something that is uncomfortable and not desired, right? So first, couple sessions, it looked a little like this.
10 count, ready? 10, 9, 8. Come closer. You're okay. You're okay. You guys are back? You guys are back?
Yeah, he's done. He was done. Yeah. So ultimately, what I wanted to do was show the machine without it being followed by a full haircut, and create a different learning history there. The same way, the example of the food, right? Being the food there available without demands of you have to eat the whole bowl, you have to eat all these pieces of chicken. Same with the machine. He normally sees the machine, it results in restraint and haircut, right? In this case, it just results in him touching the machine, it being all done, hug, and getting back to fun, right? And we did that enough times. Enough times meaning 3 weeks, 3 times a week, about, 9 sessions of doing this. And progressively it got better because he started noticing, you know what, this machine comes out and with this person, it doesn't result in restraint and haircuts and things like that. So it's not too bad. So we've gotten to the point now where it's not too bad.
Yeah, nice job. My God.
He still wants to be all done with it, but there's no, right? There's no emotional responses. There's no screaming. There's no hitting. And he's almost like intrigued by it. Yeah.
Yeah, you see?
All done. All done.
Look.
So there's a lot of work to be done there still, but obviously we're moving in the right direction there. And then the next step right there would be to now generalize over to the natural environment, go to the barbershop, continue that process there, right? And possibly visit the barbershop without it resulting in a haircut, right? Then going again one more time and having them sit, manipulate the machines a little bit, create trust, build rapport, and then he's gonna have more willingness to sit through a haircut, right? So that's kind of where we're heading there. And those are the next steps. And that's my time, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you.